had them on long before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them on long before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I know the wall's closing in, but don't you dare give up now. Poe believed in me, pull up through some bucks down. Todd told the valet pull the truck round. Push the line up that we drew it, it's just us now. Would you believe me if I told you my granny told me she prayed this? Then booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter mine. Think of who really putting on, you never come to mind. Rapping like your Spotify, tap you rappers compromise. Yeah, no need to panic, just paint the canvas. If you can feel the static, you're too close, find your balance. Embed the revolution for they prohibition bandwidth. Blood trickle from the leaders he was planning. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. Boarded that flight to Amsterdam. When my accountant and minus my family found out too and didn't like it. You're not in this alone. What Dale said and I thought he was biased. Then I got a Venmo that said copy the finest. Before my foolishness settled in. Recorded a whole tape before we got to Berlin. This close to giving up but now never again. Don't overlook the work and come expecting to win. In the end, my word, never put nothing over the squad. Got it right up under their nose and try the facade. Off the cliff with broken wings, I'm aware of the odds. Enough faith for us all, I'm the one for the job. Most days, catching sun rays, baby, look like the front page. Overthinking what they might say, have it your way. Yeah, the biggest threat is something they never seen. Dial it up, patch me into the screen. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up.
Hi, everybody in Luqman Nation. This is Jacquie Luqman. Welcome to Luqman Nation, live on Friday night. Luqman Nation, the most dangerous show on social media, on the most dangerous platform on social media. That's Black Power Media. Before we get started, just want to take care of the housekeeping. If you're joining us tonight and you have not subscribed to Black Power Media on YouTube, do that right now. Subscribe to Black Power Media. Hit the little bell so you can get the notifications whenever anyone on this platform goes live. You can support Black Power Media on Patreon at patreon.com/Black Power Media. And you can, did I say subscribe? Yes, I did. Subscribe to Black Power Media. But you can also support Luqman Nation on Patreon at patreon.com/Luqman Nation. So look, share this video, invite your friends. Should let you know that this show is pre-recorded from earlier today, so I won't be checking out your comments as the show is airing, but I will be checking on y'all later on because y'all know how y'all do in the chat. So listen, today is the United Nations International Human Rights Day, and this day purports to be important in the struggle for global and universal human rights. And in a way, it is. But when we look at human rights from the context of the struggle for Black people and all oppressed people and colonized people around the world, we have to look at International Rights Day and the UN Declaration of International the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights in the context that it was presented or that it was arrived in, and what it really means to our struggle today. So, as you can see, my guest, and she's not even a guest, she's a friend, she's a comrade, she's a sis, and I'm so glad that Erica Caines is with me to talk about this subject of international human rights, particularly as a member of Black Alliance for Peace and the Black radical human rights tradition that we continue to carry on as members of Black Alliance for Peace. So, Erica, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I always love coming on this platform, so I appreciate it.
I always love having you around. I love you and Zion, and just it's. I mean, I have to. The first, I have to give the disclosure that I am, as I said, I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace DC. Uh, I'm a representative of the Mid Atlantic region of Black Alliance for Peace. You're a member of Black Alliance for Peace Baltimore.
Yes.
So we represent the part of the Mid Atlantic contingent of Black Alliance for Peace. So it's a BAP takeover tonight on
It is.
Luqman Nation.
That.
BAP. So first thing first, I want to get a little bit of the history out of the way, and I'm not even going to spend a whole lot of time on the history because I think the only thing we really need to understand about International Human Rights Day is that it arose out of World War II.
Mm.
So, and this is, I think, Ricky, important. And let me magnify this screen a little bit so people can see it and read it. And this is from the United Nations, the body that um, uh, developed and ratified the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They admit, they say in their own history that it was drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world. And it was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on December 1948. Now, this was after World War II, obviously. So, the context in which the Universal Declaration for Human Rights was developed was that it came out of the and I hate to call it, Ricky, like World War, because World War One, World War Two were actually not a war involving the entire world. It there were wars involving the colonized nations of the world, the European nations. It was the white war. It was white
Yeah,
people's war.
ruling class war mostly.
Right. So when we talk about the fact that World War II was not a war of all of the nations of the world, it was a
Mm.
war of the largely imperial European nations of the world. Then this Universal Declaration for Human Rights and the claim that um, all of the regions and different representatives of the world equally participated in drafting this resolution, that makes me a little bit suspect because I don't trust that the ruling powers that entered into this war in World War II would give other countries equal representation and equal say into what human rights are and are not, and who have and who can have them around the world. But that's how I see it, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that history of the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
Right. I don't disagree with you on the point you're making about it not being a really inclusive sort of declaration, right? And what I was thinking of when you were noting the history, because I in fact did not know up until recently that it was drafted post World War II. I was thinking about the way that Veterans Day, the Day of Peace, sort of came out of World War I, and we see what it has manifested into. and how it's applied. So I think that because these are imperialist draft, these are things that are declared and drafted up by imperialist powers, and other people don't get to say that the way that it's manifested also doesn't include us. So that's why I guess colonized nations today see the wrath of the Western sort of human rights policies.
Yeah, and of course, the post colonial nations,
Mhm.
and they really can't be called post colonial nations because they just continue to colonize their former colonies through capitalism,
Right,
through multinational corporations, with using military force, and usually, if not at the direction of, but certainly for the benefit of the United States, which is the great imperialist power in the world today. So, but even back then, I think the question that I have about the United Nations itself, too, is when we understand the context of how the Declaration of Human Rights came about, I have to ask, is the United Nations itself like a fair arbiter of human rights? I mean, why should we trust the United Nations to decide what human rights are and who can have them? And have they really had a track record of upholding human rights of people around the world, especially given the history of the United Nations, which also came out of the same war, Ricky?
right, right. I think that's the same question that people ask about, the we charge colonialism or we charge genocide, the utility of the United Nations, especially when we understand the history that they come out of these same imperialist powers, and also that the U.S. could just very much not abide by any of it because there's a smaller group within the United Nations that have so much power and wield so much power, which also highlights the hypocrisy of the Declaration as it stands, or even the U.S. having any say in democracy. But I think that when we turn to the U.S., even I recall when the Venezuelan embassy, when there was an incident there, and we say, this is a violation of UN internationalist law. We point to these things, not that they have any significant meaning as far as being upheld at the United Nations, but that these things do actually exist. And there is some utility in pushing it, if we go to, I guess, the extent of through the courts or through the law internationally, or at least making enough noise or using it for our own propaganda, to push back against. But I mean, the United Nations is full of hypocrisy, and it always has been. So I don't think that its Declaration of Human Rights. I think even the United Nations declaring it, as we understand the history of it and the foundations of it, and who has the power in it, sort of gives way and leverage to the way that these Western nations use it to sort of push their own hegemony and their own interests.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I think for people who don't know the history of the United States, because you know that I love history, and I talk about it all the time when we talk about almost anything, because in order for us to get anywhere beyond where we are now to a better place, we have to know how we got here so that we don't make the same dumb mistakes we made, and
Mhm.
we don't fall for the same propaganda and BS that was given to us to get us to this point, right?
Right.
So,
Libertarian.
and yeah, I mean, so this article was written by the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace, Ajamu Baraka, and it's called Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 70, and this was from 2018. And
Okay.
so we're talking about 73 now, I guess. It's 73 years old, this document. Time to decolonize human rights. And he does go into the history of the United Nations here. And I'm going to scroll down. And I'm going to provide everyone with a link to this article so you can read it for yourself. But where did the United Nations come from? And let me find it. There we go. In August 1941, and again, I keep forgetting to magnify my screen so you can read what I'm reading too. So the United Nations emerged in 19 after World War II, also after the defeat by the Soviet Red Army of the Nazi forces in Germany. Something called the Atlantic Charter was produced by the United States and Great Britain, what Great Britain at the time, remember, folks, was the imperial power of the world at the time. The United States, after World War II, emerged as a comparable power, imperial power to Great Britain, and has now surpassed Great Britain to the point that Britain is not an imperial power anymore, so to speak. But the charter, the Atlantic Charter, stated that all people have the right to choose the form of government under which they live. That's what the document said. But as Ajamu points out in this article, for the 700 million colonial subjects and the tens of thousands conscripted to fight in this war, this was music to their ears. But remember, this document was created by the US and the UK, which the UK had colonies.
Right. Still does.
And still does, and still does. So do we really believe that the imperial power at the time was going to allow the people in those colonies to choose for themselves the form of government under which they wanted to live? Absolutely not.
No.
So, when we understand that this is the basis for the foundation of the United Nations, the Atlantic Charter, um, which was declared or formed in January 1942 by 26 nations that were then at war, and then joined by another 21 nations. The Declaration of the United Nations endorsed the Atlantic Charter and expressed the conviction that complete victory over their enemies, the 57 nations,
Right.
is essential to defend life, liberty, independence, religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justice in their own lands and as well as other lands. But again, we go back to the Atlantic Charter and who drafted that, the US and the UK, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. They, of course, they didn't want to apply their colonial subjects in their territories to this freedom that they wrote that charter to give themselves, right? So, this is really important in understanding what the United Nations is, Ricky, and how I think we should be careful um, in how we view the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that comes from this entity.
Right. And then furthermore, wasn't Israel sort of established through World War II? So yeah, so it's hypocrisy. But I kind of chuckled. It was Churchill's name, like to be included in human rights, a declaration. It's just
it's and
better than I.
I mean, Winston Churchill is, aside from him being a racist pig,
Yeah.
he is the man who wanted to nuke Russia before World War II even ended. And remember, it was the Soviet Union that won World War II. They're the ones who actually defeated the Nazis. But Winston Churchill, they claimed in one of his drunken tirades, but I'm not even gonna say the man was drunk. He was just a monster.
Yeah.
He wanted to nuke the then Soviet Union because they always claim, oh, the communism, but really, if you look at the way the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany is overshadowed in the US and the UK, you understand that the Soviet Union could never have been given the credit for ending World War II.
Yeah.
They could never have been given the credit of actually beating the US or the UK at their own game at winning a war.
Right.
So,
I only learned really maybe like 10 years ago that the Soviets won the war. That's like not anything taught to me in school at
mhm,
all. The whole
mhm,
narrative is that the US, beat Nazi Germany and then they saved, the Jews from encampment and brought them over. And then, the actual history is like, no, they actually brought the Nazis over to start NASA. And,
right.
and they didn't even initially want to get involved in the war. And so many, like Coco Chanel and Ford and what Hugo Boss, so many
Yep.
people were involved and profiting
Uh-huh.
off of, Nazi Germany. They were Nazis themselves. So yeah, but I find that intriguing, especially when, as Stalin is depicted as evil as Hitler.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, and I feel like we always have to say this because there's always going to be someone watching who says, but they did kill people. Look, we're not propping up any particular leader. We're
Right,
calling out the hypocrisies and the contradictions of these so-called freedom-loving governments, because they're not. They're
right,
they're they're not whatsoever. So, Ricky, this leads me to the next point, and this is our involvement, the
mm,
struggle of Black people in this notion of human rights, against the backdrop of this history of the United Nations, and, Roosevelt and Churchill, and none of these people really caring about the human rights of people who look like you and me. They,
right.
they certainly wouldn't now, and we know they didn't did then.
Mhm.
um, how do we look at the radical Black struggle for human rights, um, in that context, now that we understand where these entities come from?
Right. So I think that that question is answered the best with understanding the purpose of Black Alliance for Peace, or the utility of Black Alliance for Peace and its goals ultimately. BAP understands that there's a structural crisis of capitalism, and in its neoliberal form, it's created a legitimacy crisis. Um, so through practices, and support and works towards shifting correlation and balance forces like anti-colonial struggles and et cetera, et cetera. A lot of our work is about liberation and self-determination and actual people-centered human rights. So that's why we're involved in Haiti and the Americas. That's why we're involved in shutdown AFRICOM campaigns and solidarity works with Afghanistan and Palestine. And then even domestically here with the No Compromise, No Retreat campaign, it all raises the question of what human rights and sovereignty actually means. And we see the ways that human rights is weaponized to impose sanctions on the Horn, in Venezuela, the blockade of Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. So what BAP does is sort of draw the connections from not just there, but here as well. We see the sanctions exist through welfare reform, through that newly formed, $600 tax. Um,
Mhm, mhm.
we can argue that's a form of sanctions, the housing, what's happening. So, and that's all, imposed through a sort of militarized policing that denies any sort of self-determination or any sort of human rights. We don't have any basic human rights: education, Medicare, healthcare. And I think what BAP does is kind of shift through the idea of social justice, um, that just relies on the dynamics between the police and community without looking at the ills of social justice fluidly that mirror um, what's happening internationally and globally through imperialism. Understanding that we are colonized people and we're colonized politically, um, socially, economically. Just as Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton explained in Black, excuse me, in Black Power, um, but just basically making those connections and having those basic understandings of what human rights actually is in the face of what it proclaims to be or what America proclaims to be, and how that is denied to us on its most basic form daily in our material realities. That puts us on our face in understanding the hypocrisy.
Yeah, I mean that is definitely true, and there are a couple of things that you said that I absolutely want to hit on. Um, but first, I think because today is International Human Rights Day, of course, we can't have a conversation about the struggle for human rights in the United States, especially the struggle for human rights involving Black people, without a statement from the White House. so, so yes, the Biden administration has proclaimed on this day, International Human Rights Day of 2021. Oh my God, they made it International Human Rights Week.
Oh,
But yeah, but they did it yesterday, which was Thursday. So anyway, so the Biden White House issued a proclamation proclaiming, uh, uh, you know, that they love human rights, I suppose.
mm,
and um, down further down in the statement, oh my gosh, Biden says that since taking office, my administration has put human rights at the center of our domestic and foreign policy priorities. Whew, I can't even read any further because just when we talk about the Biden administration's response to the pandemic,
right.
that right there, that makes this statement a blatant lie, Ricky.
Hmm. Well, among other things, but yes, specifically that.
So he goes on to say that on my first day in office, I signed an executive order to advance racial equity and support for underserved communities as part of our once in a generation investment in our national physical infrastructure. We're also strengthening equitable access to our shared resources and environment, including providing additional blah 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 blah. Okay, look, all of this foolishness about the Biden administration specifically and the US government in general having any kind of respect or regard for human rights is absolute garbage.
Hmm.
When you look at the things that you just mentioned, I mean, the lack of support in this country from this government for people during the pandemic, the ongoing racialized capitalist discrimination and oppression, ongoing racialized police terrorism, but also the class war against working class and poor and oppressed people in this country. There are strikes going on, and they have been growing and intensifying in this country in blue collar industries, from Nabisco to Kellogg to Lay's to because people realize that it is wrong to work people 10, 12 hours a day for $7.25 an hour with no benefits. That's a
Right.
violation of human dignity.
Right.
And I mean, so the United States is certainly no arbiter of human rights, but particularly when it comes to the struggle of Black people in this country, against this system of racism and white supremacy.
Right.
And it's something that, once again, I'm going to share another article from uh, uh, Ajamu Baraka. Yes, he writes a lot.
We actually republished this piece in her communist
Oh,
yesterday.
beautiful, beautiful. And but see, this isn't even a new conversation we're having.
No.
This is a conversation that Malcolm X and contemporaries of his time were raising about the Black radical struggle for human rights in this country. And in particular, Ricky, Malcolm, I think, was one of the first to make the differentiation between the Black radical tradition of human rights struggle
Hmm.
and centering human rights on political rights. So, I mean, what is that? How do you explain that for people who don't quite get that there is a difference?
Well, I just want to say before I answer that, because there were some points that you hit on, and I just want to remind people that the United States was charged with genocide. So
Mm,
to even be speaking about human rights, it's obvious, obvious hypocrisy. But I do think it's important that we remind folks that the United States was in fact charged with genocide this year, at the tribunal, which is very important to know, and for all the reasons that we named, and also amongst them political prisoners. Um, the prison population in this country is obscene. Um, the amount of prisons that exist is ridiculous, and it does push. It helps push that platform. So we do need to continue to raise that the United States was charged with genocide. But I do want to read this one point that Ajamu made in that piece. That is one of the reasons why we wanted to um, republish it, because it is, it's an older piece. I think from like 2015 almost. Um, but he says, by shifting the center of human rights struggle away from advocacy to struggle, Malcolm laid the foundation for a more relevant form of human rights struggle for people still caught in the tentacles of Euro American colonial dominance. The people centered human rights approach that creates human rights from the bottom up views human rights as an arena of struggle. Human rights does not emanate from legalistic texts negotiated by states. It comes from the aspirations of the people. Unlike the liberal conception of human rights that elevates some mystical notions of natural law, which is really bourgeoisie law, as the foundation of rights. The people in formation are the ethical foundation and source of people's centered human rights. So I think that just sums up a lot of what Malcolm X was pushing forward, and a lot of what the article is about, and breaking down the differences between the U.S. and the West's notion of a people-centered human right. I mean, excuse me, of human rights, and an actual people-centered human rights that's based on that political foundation of understanding ourselves and our material conditions.
and this is the republished article in Hood Communist from this week. I'll be giving you all the link to this article so that you can read it yourselves. So, I mean, Ricky, and I'm so glad you also brought up we charge the conviction of genocide, and I did just share that link, but I'll show it again. That the Mandela Tribunal did convene a panel of international jurists and charged the U.S. or actually found them guilty of genocide because of the issues that you raised that we've both been raising and that BAP raises all the time, the racial discrimination, the xenophobia, but particularly because of the treatment of political prisoners and the treatment of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people historically throughout this country. So I will give people also a link to that information because that is a very, very important development for us to organize around that flies in the face, Ricky,
Right.
of this idea that the United States is this arbiter of human rights. It just is not.
Right. And also, I always commend my comrade Onye, who's also a co-editor of Hood Communist. In one of our PEs that we had, um, she talks about like the propaganda that's around the U.S. that makes it difficult for people to understand the U.S. actual position in human rights or what it's actually doing. And she makes the point that there's a frustration that we may have as organizers who may have a certain clarity that others don't, but we also have to have that understanding that we are oversaturated with a sort of American exceptionalist lens that posits America, just as Joe Biden positions it, as the arbitrator of democracy. Meanwhile, there's obscene sanctions across the globe, and we understand that sanctions kill. Sanctions do not attack people individually. Sanctions attack the entire population. Sanctions make it difficult for people to have those sovereign human rights, like medical, like education, like transportation, even, and access. So I think it's very important to note that there is a particular propaganda that's that we're oversaturated with, actually, that platforms like this and Hood Communists, and the work that BAP does, to expose, and make these connections clear. And we need that particular clarity, because I think without that too, we don't even understand our connections, in a more internationalist aspect. We would only see what's happening to us and not understanding, that yet America, like I even with Afghanistan, right? The issues about human rights, like the way that America would rush to the Afghans, to the
Right,
Afghani side,
right.
without taking care of what's happening here with Black Americans and in our colonized communities. And I think we don't really understand the way that human rights is weaponized by the U.S. empire, for its own interests. So it's not even a given, sort of, and who they let in. It's
Mm.
also, a token and a tribute to that same notion of human rights.
So do you think, Ricky, that this is where people get stuck when we talk about domestic and foreign policy and internationalism, as you were just saying, and why we need to have an international focus? Because the way I see people responding to things like that, some people, some Black people responding to things like that is, well, this is why I don't care about what happens in other countries. This is why I'm not concerned about what the U.S. does in other countries. We have to take care of our own first, and they develop this, we're Black Americans
Yeah.
kind of attitude, as opposed to being able to point out the hypocrisy and the contradictions of the United States making a big deal about protecting women in Afghanistan when women are still having to fight for reproductive justice and bodily autonomy in this country, and there's no such thing as a safe and constitutional right to reproductive services everywhere in this country. I mean, how do you see why do we get tripped up like that?
Um, I always like to I mean, it's a paraphrase at this point, but I always like to lean to when Maurice Bishop, and Maurice Bishop speaks. There's a part where he talks about having come into New York for the first time, and the amount of advertisements and propaganda that he was like on face with, and that's our daily, daily, daily. So, we have to be able to cut through those. I mean, I think we underestimate how much, because we think that we do have a certain influence of power because we are able to manage our social medias, but we don't control those platforms. So I think that kind of trips us up about how much power we do have in our circumstances, especially, in understanding a more global dynamic. When CNN and MSNBC are positioned as real news,
Mm,
and they
mm.
are constantly attacking, the world, essentially, because the U.S. is currently, at war or aggressive with a large majority of the world. Um, That is not an understatement. Um, because of course these are colonized nations, so they may seem smaller, but these are a lot of colonized nations.
Right.
These are a lot of regions that the U.S. has a military footprint. So we have to take those things in consideration. But I think that funnels us into these sort of U.S. centric dynamics because we only understand our conditions here. And then also Obama years, the highest stage of counterinsurgency, kind of doubled down on that break of internationalism where our struggles were clearly aligned and clearly understood. Even if there were some disagreements and there were some contradictions, we understood imperialism to an extent where that was the primary contradiction, where now that's kind of muddled. And I always kind of like I'm confused at people who are so anti-capitalist but not anti-imperialist
Mm.
because anti-imperialism is the highest stage. But again, I think that there needs to be some sort of foundation to engage folk, not beyond Black Power Media and beyond Hood Communists, where we can have these conversations about what it looks like for us, what it looks like for others, our connections, and the main fight. Because I don't think we could be able to tackle all the other issues that are human rights issues communally without understanding the sort of pan-Europeanism that's existing, that is undermining any sort of sovereignty that we are trying to engage and accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the Obama years was just I agree with you, and I know it's true because I think that first 4 years I was kind of duped too.
Right,
I'm like, well, the Republicans really are racist and they're making it hard for the guy, but I think at like the first a year of the second term, I'm like, now hold on. I mean, you're not going to be elected again. You can't be. So what
right,
do you have to lose? So and then I realized, oh, it's not a matter of him having anything to lose. It's a matter of him never intending to do anything for working class poor
right,
and oppressed people,
right.
especially black people. And oh my God, look at what he did to that whole African nation of Libya.
Right. It was really Libya that was the turning point because I think I rode that wave initially of, Gaddafi's a bad man,
Sure,
that
sure.
way for a bit, and then further investigation, and then all credit to Glenn Ford and Black Agenda Report,
Hmm.
because then that put me on the right track of investigating these things for myself and seeing like, wait a minute, um,
Yeah.
so like one, the attributing Obama as like the something, the era where it was doubled down, where the connections were not made. It was just like people were not able to see that the same man who was telling us, to pull up our pants and, telling black men to be, to stay in the household and it was their fault. And those kind of, this kind of rhetoric is the same man that went to Africa and said, get over colonialism. And I
Yes, he
don't think that
did.
any of these things are different, right? Where we're not addressing the primary issue here. Like, it's like, well, colonialism was a thing of the past and the civil rights movement is done. So if anything, it's your own fault. And that was always his line. And I think not being able to connect that or see that because we were entrenched with the idea that one of us could represent empire, without understanding what that means for any of us,
Hmm.
and then not seeing any of the fruits of that, right, of our grassroots labor that helped elevate that man. Well, maybe.
I mean,
But yeah, yeah,
yeah, I mean, the more I read about the backstory of Obama, or the more I did read, because
right,
at this point, I don't care anymore. I know what it was, But I realized and I learned that just like every other U.S. politician, he was chosen to be in that. He was
right,
chosen, so I kind of want us to let ourselves off the hook for,
right, right, right.
like I think and as somebody who's always been a little bit more radical, but maybe have not always been like, socialist, communist kind of radical until of late, I think that it was okay for us as Black people in this country to have some kind of hope that we could get something out of Obama, because it was a system, we live in a system that gave us absolutely nothing
Right.
for so long. So, and yes, he and his family did face, the typical racism in this country. And, white people literally, they lost their minds because a Black man family was in the White House, and all of that was true. But I think that we saw, Ricky, the difference between Black folks who are actually radical and who are serious about liberation for our people, and Black folks who are honestly just, happy to go along and get along.
Right.
When that divide happened, right, when those Black folks like Glenn Ford and Bruce Dixon and, Cornel West and folks began to criticize Obama in public, and then you had the rest of the so-called Black leadership, or the Black misleadership as Glenn called them,
Mhm.
telling folks to shut up.
Right. It's still they still do.
And
Still would
as
like to shut up. But
yep.
yeah, but no, to your point, I do recall like that moment where I was like, "What's that bus about?" It was touring that bus around, and they had their own contradictions with that, but it was something that just the reaction to it, like Michael Eric Dyson's reaction to it, was so strong that it's like, wait a minute, so we can't say nothing about him.
Right.
We can't,
Right. We
and
can't.
that's really what made me perk up. And I think because it was so insulated, it was such a guard and a shield around Obama, like anything
Mhm.
that was being done under that presidency, in the vein and in the name of the US was a-okay. And that's why Libya flied. Libya was a human rights issue, right?
Right.
That's why it
Right.
made it okay. Honduras was a human rights issue.
Mhm.
And it made it okay. Syria, a human rights issue, and it made it okay. And we're seeing remnants of that with what's happening in the Horn, the way that they're able to use these, and then not only that, but then weaponize that these people are people of color, so they must be saved. So it's that American saviorism, exceptionalism. It's just that product, and I think that when I note Obama is to say that those 8 years really doubled down on a lot of how we, as a whole, saw ourselves within America. Like we now begin to
Mhm.
see ourselves as a piece of the American puzzle, where before there was a clear understanding that we did not fit.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
so
Yeah, that was deep right there, because I think that's like, okay, I get the historical significance, and we're gonna move off Obama, it because this is not a conversation about that dude. This is a conversation but I think that is the importance, but also like the curse, if you will, of the significance of the historical significance of his presidency. Yes, it is historically significant that a Black man was president of the United Snakes, right? Okay. But the curse is that the Black man was a neoliberal, capitalist, imperialist warmonger
right,
who didn't, who never intended to do anything but uphold the current domestic and international hegemony of the U.S. Um, during his almost 10 years. I mean, that's a whole decade.
right. And that's also
That
the only way one could become president, is to do that, because that is the foundation of the US, which
Mhm.
speaks to the hypocrisy of that declaration, or Joe Biden even, proclaiming a week now. It's a whole week.
It's a whole week, and I didn't see when the week is supposed to start, because the proclamation was issued yesterday, which is Thursday, and it's Friday.
Yeah.
So I don't know. But anyway, it doesn't matter because it's all bullshit. Um, but the other thing you said that I think is very, very important is that we must understand that you don't have imperialism without capitalism, and that capitalism always, always leads to, because capitalism is just it's just the amassing of power attached with money.
Mm.
It is the financial pursuit of power.
Right.
Any kind of way you want to, it's the monetizing of people and labor and putting a price tag on everything, and any kind of way you want to describe capitalism. You have to understand that capitalism involves uh, uh, monetizing the natural world and
Right.
making a profit off of it.
Right.
And the more entities are able to do that, well, they use up all of their immediate resources to monetize. So what do? They expand.
Yeah.
And then it becomes imperialism
Right.
when they are gobbling up resources that are far away from them. And I'm trying to explain this as if I'm explaining it to my grandmother. That's how I always think of explaining these concepts. Like if I'm
No.
talking to my grandma, how can I explain it so she can get it? So, when you're a capitalist, you have put a price tag on everything you can around you in your immediate area, but eventually you run out of things that you can monetize and profit off of. But there's this other place like across the river that has stuff that you haven't profited off of yet.
Right.
So you go over there, but they don't want you to do that. So then you send the military to make them do it. And that's imperialism.
Or you.
So there,
Uh,
there is no,
I was
oh,
going to
what
say,
was
or
that?
you, without even without militaries, we're finding now that you can strum up dissent and then
Right.
push for coups. Yeah. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but all with the
Yep.
same intention to get that, to control that niche of the world, which happens to be the global south or the third world nations in the continent.
Exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, we do have to understand that you don't have capitalism without imperialism. And
Right.
yes, some countries are capitalists, some have some capitalist aspects to their economy, like China. China does have an element of capitalism in their economy, but China is not imperialist.
Right. And it should
China
also
doesn't. No,
No,
go ahead.
it should also be noted that, these socialist revolutions, like revolutions is a process. So it's going to be continuous. Capitalists are not going to just pack up their bags and, and go away. Like,
Exactly.
they're always going to fight back to obtain that power. So we are going to, like, there's not going to be a purely socialist kind of nation,
Right.
because there are going to be people wanting to establish that power. So I think the benefits of these revolutions that they're able to keep them at at a size, control them.
Hmm.
And I guess we could that's another conversation for another day of how we see states. But
Right.
yeah,
Right.
but but to understand the Chinese government and the benefits of it, and then clearly there is no communist nation, but there are governments and nations that are trying that process of socialism, or at least trying the processes away from the capitalist as the main economic system.
Exactly. And that is the struggle, as you said, because socialism is a process that China is having with the capitalist class,
Right,
because they're trying to keep the capitalist class in check in China so that they don't become rampant, take over the government,
right,
and destroy the socialist underpinnings of the government and become an imperialist nation. You
right,
see what I mean? So that is the struggle. But you don't have imperialism anywhere without capitalism.
right,
That is really important. And I think that is one of the ways, Ricky, that we can identify with something you said earlier, which is the need to connect internationally around the issue of people-centered human rights, even if we don't have everything in common with other countries. Like me living in Washington, D.C., I don't have a whole lot in common, I don't think, with like indigenous people living in, say, Nicaragua, Our demands for what we want as human rights might be slightly different, but I still should be able to connect with them on our universal or collective demand to have our human rights realized where we are, even if there may be some differences in what we want, right?
Right. And I think that again, BAP does like I know we got a little bit of praise earlier about our work, but I can't not contribute a lot of what I know and how I have clarity on certain things without speaking on BAP and just that clear line that BAP has around issues and around anti-imperialism and understanding imperialism as a primary contradiction that affects all of us, because our self-determination, our human rights can't be determined so long as imperialism is what is affecting each and every one of us. But I do think in order to understand or see some semblances, we do have to begin to understand ourselves as colonized people, as
Mhm.
colonized communities, because the conditions that exist within African and poor working class communities here in the US are the result of intentional systematic neglect under a white supremacist capitalist imperialist system, right? And under the same constructs of pan-Europeanism. Like it is that connection between these imperial nations that is the, I guess, collective boot on the rest of the colonized
Mm.
world. Um,
Mhm.
so when people question the utility or the necessity for like Pan Africanism, right? I always push back. It's like, well, Pan Europeanism exists. So,
Right,
well,
right.
I don't know. We could have the argument about revolutionary, reactionary Pan Africanism because those are valid, but Pan Europeanism exists. And there's
Mhm.
unity there, and they don't get along. We know Europeans do not get along.
Right,
There
right.
is unity there for a specific reason. So our human rights, people centered human rights, should be what collectively unites us under Pan Africanism as a politic, as a goal for one united socialist Africa, and sovereignty in these nations.
So how do we decolonize our idea of human rights and start focusing on people-centered human rights as opposed to always looking to the UN every year on December 10th and saying, "Yay, the UN declared universal human rights." How do we get them out of this conversation and decolonize the idea of human rights and center them on people?
I think we have to put human rights on its face, right? Like, what do they mean when they suggest human rights? Just like we broke down that speech, what Biden says, we can clearly see that this year of 2021, with the pandemic alone, with we are approaching 800,000 deaths, um, despite no real actual noise being made about these things. The press secretary laughing almost at the idea that testing would be given for free at homes,
Mm,
the refusal to lock down, the push for vaccines as the one and only solvent. When we know these nations that have combated this successfully have used both resources and vaccinations to keep this underway. Um, the refusal for them to even share vaccinations is a human
mhm,
rights issue. That
mhm,
alone
mhm.
is a human rights issue. So I think that we have to put the U.S. on its face when they say human rights, and I think that the tribunal really speaks to that. The Spirit of Mandela's tribunal really laid out point by point, and this is where they got us fucked up. Like this is
Yep.
where this is not clicking, and this is why we would charge genocide about around this nation. So I think that amplifying maybe the tribunal, um, encouraging people to join organizations fighting for the liberation of your people that have a clear line about these issues that are not just specifically around social justice, um, but what social justice means in a larger framework of human rights. And I think that once we talk about that, then we can start focusing beyond police brutality, because that's not to dismiss police brutality, but but it is to signal that that is really the minimal of our issues, and the fact that it is platformed as the major issue leaves us susceptible to not even acknowledging the many ways our human rights are violated, or the many ways that our human rights are not centered in a people's project, and the many ways that this signals that we do need to start to build some sort of organizational structures, build our own independent power um, that really focuses on community control, that does answer or even raise the question of what a people-centered human rights looks like and could be.
Mm. I mean, that was perfect. And I mean, and I don't say that, because I'm giving empty, because y'all know I don't do that. Um, but I have had the pleasure of learning, and it is a pleasure for me, of learning so much from not just being a member of Black Alliance for Peace, but also being around uh, other members of Black Alliance for Peace, and learning from the efforts that they do in their regions, in their cities. The things that Baltimore has done around the 1033 program have been amazing. We have comrades in Delaware. We have other regions of the BAP organization. We just went to support members of BAP, just went to support Didan Wakiuri down in North Carolina.
Wow,
Um, I mean, yeah. I mean, so we've got folks out in the Bay Area, on the West Coast, doing amazing things. We're cooking up a lot of stuff here
yeah,
in DC. I mean, so this this work that we do in the Black Alliance for Peace is a continuation of this Black radical human rights struggle that is not centered around the United Nations, what they have declared to be human rights, what the colonized nations said were human rights, but instead it's centered around the struggle for Black liberation and freedom in this country and abroad,
right.
against those colonial powers, and their idea of human rights for themselves that excludes us.
Right, right. And I do want to shout out our trip to Greenville.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that town. It was my first time ever being there. The work that Mapaduzi is doing, um, like I was asked to speak, and I wasn't really prepared to speak, but
We're always asked, but we're never prepared. And
I'm here, right? But one of the things I did know is how much of an inspiration it is to have seen that and be able to bring it back home. Just the little things that they're doing in that town, because it is a small town. It is a small town that is facing a lot of contradictions, especially with the Black leadership class, and and the South sort of notions of, or the bastardization sort of the civil rights era that they hold
Mhm,
on to. So
mhm,
that is a struggle, but it's happening. It is happening, and you are seeing the people engaging. The Mau Mau movement, and you are seeing the people reading Lenin, and collectively, and they're organizing to get people at least get this, provide the space for people who would like to receive a vaccine to get just
mhm. Right.
on an everyday practical level. And that is the work um, that I hope to be able to bring back to this region, and because I'm deeply inspired by it, and I think that that's one of the benefits of being in such an organization like Black Alliance for Peace, that is not just an organization made up of individuals, but other organizations as well. So that you get to see the work that the Low County Action Committee is doing in Charleston, right? And we get to see what Ujima People's Progress Party is doing in Baltimore, and you get to see what PACA is doing in DC, and we
Mhm,
build off of each other's regions and community work, just to get to that point or raise that question of what does a people-centered human rights look like? What can that look like? And, and I think that the No Compromise, No Retreat campaign, what it does is bring us all outside of Charleston and Greenville and Baltimore and DC and New York into a global sphere where we can see that and understand that and make connections with the folks like HOA Pals, who deal and the U.S. Out of Africa team, and our sister organizations in Colombia and Nicaragua. So I appreciate deeply to be a part of this space and be a part of this organization and help build this organization, because these connections, I think these experiences, even that little solidarity trip, are worthwhile, but they leave such an impact that it does drive you to believe, like any kind of pessimism, because these online spaces, these social media spaces, they do a lot for you now sometimes, where you be like, you just want to throw in the towel because it's a lot of confusion, so much so that how can I break through that? But then this solidarity trip sort of emphasize that it's not really me doing it, it's us doing it, and it's a bunch of us doing it, and we're doing it in these small pockets, and then we can also come together and unite and make it bigger and larger. And I think that is what we're seeing progress in Black Alliance for Peace. So shout out to BAP, No Compromise, No Retreat.
No compromise, no retreat, indeed. And you know what? I'm glad that you ended, and we're going to end on this, that you said that social media would be doing the most to just make you feel like it's this is an uphill battle, and we're not going to win. But I have to remind myself that Fred Hampton, the eternal chairman Fred Hampton, said you have to understand that people have to pay a price for peace. If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you don't dare to struggle, then you don't deserve to win.
Right.
But damn it, we're gonna struggle.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that I'm struggling in the Black Alliance for Peace with comrades like Erica Caines. Because the Black Alliance for Peace is, if I'm not mistaken, probably the largest Black-led peace organization in the world.
Yes.
So social media ain't got nothing on us. And as far as I'm concerned, from what I can see, we will win. So thank you so much, Erica Caines, for joining me today on Luqman Nation. This was so great. It was just so wonderful. And it just gives me all the hope in the world that, yeah, we really will. We really will win this shit.
Thank you for having me. I adore you. And I want to close out with saying drop the charges on day done.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. So thanks a lot, you all, for joining us tonight. Dare to struggle, dare to win. We will win. Victory is certain. Peace. Take good care of yourselves. See you next time.
Peace, Africans.
And they are out here throwing up the peace sign like they won something. Yep. I don't understand what they think they want.
I need to revise. I did see white people this happy. I gave the example of America and the Allies' defeat over Nazi Germany. But I haven't seen this many white people happy. There was a couple periods in history. One was when Nutella was introduced. And I haven't seen that many white people happy since Nutella was introduced and marketed and stuff. Because white people love Nutella.
They booked the surgery just to pull me out of the basement. Right back where I started, nothing to show for a facelift. Got pushed playing Walter White and Davis, never felt so dangerous. The type of power they can't quantify. And name the best from my region, you gotta utter mine. Think of who really putting on, you never come to mind. Rapping like your Spotify, tap you rappers compromise. Yeah, no need to panic, just paint the canvas. If you can feel the static, you're too close, find your balance. Embed the revolution for their prohibition bandwidth. Blood trickle from the leaders he was planning. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top when I'm a mile up. Bought at that flight to Amsterdam. When my accountant and minus my family found out too and didn't like it. You're not in the salon with Dale said and I thought he was biased. Then I got a Venmo that said copy the finest. Before my foolishness settled in, recorded a whole tape before we got to Berlin. This close to giving up but now never again. Don't overlook the work and come expecting to win. In the end, my word, never put nothing over the squad. Got it right up under their nose and try the facade. Off the cliff with broken wings, I'm aware of the odds. Enough faith for us all, I'm the one for the job. Most days, catching sun rays, baby, look like the front page. Overthinking what they might say, have it your way. Yeah, the biggest threat is something they never seen. Dial it up, patch me into the screen. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all line before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up.